The morning sun spilled over the rolling hills of the Whitaker Ranch, painting the grass in long golden strokes. The air was crisp enough that each breath hung like a puff of smoke before vanishing. Jamie Whitaker's boots crunched over frost-hardened soil as he trotted after his father, who was already striding toward the barn with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a man who had spent a lifetime moving with the rhythm of the land. "Come on, Jamie, the calves won't wait for us to sleep in," Caleb called without turning around. His voice was low and warm, but there was no softness in the pace he set. Jamie's legs were shorter, but he tried to match it, his breath puffing hard as they reached the barn. The scent of hay, leather, and the faint musk of animals wrapped around him, familiar and comforting. It was a smell that said home, even if home sometimes felt too quiet. Caleb set about the morning chores with his usual efficiency, checking the feed bins, hauling hay, refilling water troughs. Jamie fetched tools, tugged open gates, and offered the occasional question about the work, which his father answered in short, steady sentences. Their words filled the air just enough to cover the silence, but never enough to crowd it. That was the way things had been since Jamie's mother passed. The ranch ran on routine, on the sure hands of a man who had learned to bear his own weight without leaning on anyone else. But for Jamie, who still remembered the warmth of a woman's laughter in these same stalls, the space between those words sometimes felt like a hollow room echoing in his chest. When the last of the feed was scattered and the barn swept clean, Caleb rested his hand briefly on Jamie's shoulder. "You did good today," he said, and that was all. Jamie swallowed the small surge of pride and followed his father toward the house. Inside, the kitchen smelled of strong coffee and toast. They ate at the small square table, Caleb reading a thin newspaper from the town's general store, Jamie silently watching steam curl up from his cup of milk. Later that afternoon, they hitched the wagon for the trip into town. Supplies had to be bought, mail picked up, and it was one of the rare chances for Jamie to see other faces. The town was small, a scattering of wooden storefronts, the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer, and the dusty main road that carried the few travelers who passed through. Inside the general store, Mr. Harris, a wiry man with a head full of white hair, leaned on the counter and grinned as soon as he saw them. "Caleb Whitaker," he said, "you're looking more like your pa every year. Means it's about time you found yourself a lady to keep you company out there on that big ranch." Jamie's head snapped up at the words. He turned to watch his father's reaction. Caleb's expression didn't change much, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something between discomfort and amusement. "Not looking for company," Caleb said simply, unloading sacks of flour onto the counter. Harris chuckled. "Well, I keep hearing about these mail-order brides, city women looking for a good man and a quiet place to settle down. You might think on it. Beats talking to the cows all winter." Jamie noticed the faint twitch of his father's jaw. "I've got my hands full as it is," Caleb said, ending the conversation. But the words had taken root in Jamie's mind. Mail-order bride. A woman looking for a place to belong. Someone who might want a home. And maybe, just maybe, a little boy who needed a mother. While Caleb discussed the price of feed with Mr. Harris, Jamie wandered to the far end of the store. There, stacked beside the sewing thread and penny candy, was a small pile of printed catalogs. On the cover, in careful lettering, was Frontier Matchmaking Agency. Jamie's fingers hovered over it. His heart beat faster. He glanced over his shoulder. Caleb's back was still turned. Sliding one copy under his coat, he tucked it inside like a secret treasure. They rode back to the ranch with the wagon full of supplies. Caleb focused on the road, the reins loose in his hands. Jamie kept silent, cradling the catalog against his side, feeling its stiff paper through the fabric of his coat. That night, when the lantern in the kitchen burned low and Caleb's bedroom door closed, Jamie crept from his bed. He carried the catalog to the kitchen table, setting it down like something precious. Page after page showed photographs, women in neat dresses, some smiling shyly, others looking straight at the camera as if daring the viewer to speak first. Each had a short description, name, age, where they were from, what they hoped to find. Jamie didn't know which woman might answer. Maybe any of them would. He fetched paper and a stubby pencil from the shelf and began to write, tongue caught between his teeth as he formed each careful letter. Dear Miss, my name is Jaimes Whitaker. I'm 8. My daddy is the best man you'll ever meet, but he works too hard and he's lonely. You need a home and I need a mommy. Maybe you could be both. He paused, tapping the pencil against the paper. What else could he say? He didn't want to sound like a baby, but he wanted her to know they would take care of her too. He added, the ranch is big, and the stars are real bright here. We have a dog named Scout, and he's friendly. I can help with chores. Please write back if you can come. Jaimes signed his name, folded the letter, and slid it into an envelope addressed to the agency's return address printed on the back of the catalog. He licked the flap closed, heart thudding at the taste of glue. Tomorrow he would slip it into the outgoing mail when his father wasn't looking. Hundreds of miles away, the city of Chicago hummed with a different kind of life. Streetcars clanged along crowded roads, smoke curled from factory chimneys, and the air smelled faintly of coal and wet pavement. Elena Morales stepped out of a boarding house, her coat pulled tight against the November wind. She had spent the morning at the school where she'd been teaching for the past year, handing out final reading assignments before the winter term ended. But her thoughts weren't on her students. They were on the notice in her pocket, the one from her landlord informing her that the building had been sold, and she had until the end of the month to vacate her small apartment. 2 weeks ago, her engagement had ended in a quiet, cutting conversation. Her fiancé, well-meaning but pragmatic, had said she worked too much, cared too much about other people's children, and refused to consider leaving the city for a more comfortable life in the suburbs. He'd walked away with barely a backward glance. Now, with no home, no fiancé, and only her modest teacher's wages, Elena felt like the ground beneath her was shifting. She'd gone to the post office that afternoon, expecting nothing more than a bill or two. Instead, tucked among the usual envelopes, there was a letter with a return address she didn't recognize, the Frontier Matchmaking Agency. She sat on her narrow bed, turning the envelope over in her hands. When she broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper, she expected a polite, perhaps awkward letter from some bachelor in the West. What she found instead made her breath catch. The handwriting was uneven, the words simple and earnest. The voice was not that of a man, but a boy. By the time she reached the line, "You need a home, and I need a mommy," something inside her chest tightened and warmed all at once. She read it twice more, imagining the boy who had written it, picturing the father he described. Elena smiled, the first true smile in days, and set the letter in her lap. She didn't know if she was foolish for even considering it, but she felt, for the first time in weeks, that maybe her life wasn't closing in. Maybe it was about to open wide. The wind over the plains carried the faintest whisper of winter. Days felt shorter now, the sun slipping toward the horizon before Jaimes was ready to put away his toys, and the cold creeping in through the walls of the old ranch house. It had been a week since he'd sent the letter. Every morning after Caleb went to the barn, Jaimes checked the mailbox nailed to the front gate, his breath catching each time he lifted the lid. Nothing. He tried to be patient, telling himself it would take a long time for a letter to travel all those miles, but still, he hoped. One morning, after a stretch of icy nights, Caleb came back from town, with the mail tucked under his arm. He dropped a small stack onto the kitchen table, a seed catalog, a bill from the feed store, and one envelope that was different. The paper was smooth, the handwriting neat, and his name, Jaimes Whitaker, was printed carefully across the front. Jaimes' pulse leapt. He snatched it up before Caleb could look too closely. "What's that?" Caleb asked, his brow furrowing. Jaimes forced a casual shrug. "Just something from school, I think." He slipped the envelope into his pocket and ducked his head over his cereal. Later, alone in the hayloft with Scout curled at his side, he tore it open. Inside was a single page of tidy script, the ink just slightly faded from the press of a fountain pen. "Dear Jaimes, Ich and Jen, thank you for your letter. I don't think anyone has ever asked me for something so important in such a kind way. I live in the city of Chicago. Have you ever seen a city? There are so many buildings here. The streets are busy every hour. and in the winter, the wind is cold enough to make you hide your nose in your scarf. I work as a teacher, and I love reading stories with my students. I imagine your ranch must be very different from here. Will you tell me more about it? Sincerely, heavy, Elena Morales. Jaime read it twice, then a third time, feeling the shape of her name in his mouth. Elena. He liked the sound of it. He set the letter beside him, pulling the pencil stub from his pocket and scribbling a reply on a scrap of paper. He told her about the ranch, about the way the hills looked gold in the morning and blue at dusk. He told her about Scout, the dog who never let coyotes near the cattle. And at the end, he wrote, "I hope you can come here someday. My daddy is quiet, but he's a good man. You'd like him." When Caleb found the folded paper on the counter later that evening, addressed to the same agency return address as the first one, his eyes narrowed. "Jaime, what's this?" Jaime froze, the dish towel in his hands dripping water onto the floor. Caleb picked up the paper, reading the few short lines before glancing back at his son. "You've been writing to someone." Jaime's voice was barely above a whisper. "I wrote to a lady. From a catalog. She needed a home. And I thought, maybe she could be my mom." Caleb's mouth tightened. He set the paper down, rubbing the back of his neck. "Jaime, you can't just—" "People don't." He stopped, letting out a breath. "You don't understand how complicated that is." She wrote back. Jaime said quickly, and pulled the first letter from his pocket, holding it out like a shield. Caleb hesitated before taking it. His eyes moved over the words, and though his expression didn't change much, something in the set of his shoulders softened. He read it again, slower this time, and when he looked at Jaime, the sternness had ebbed. "You shouldn't be keeping secrets," he said, but his voice was quieter now. "If she wants to write, I'll answer, just so she knows, just so she understands." That night, after Jaime was in bed, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with a letter in front of him. He stared at it for a long time before picking up his pen. His handwriting was strong and even, his words measured. He thanked her for her kindness in writing to his son, explained that the ranch was a hard place to live, that it wasn't the life for everyone. He wasn't looking for a wife, he told her, but he appreciated her taking the time to write back. When Elena received his letter in Chicago, she sat at her desk in the small rented room and traced her fingers over the bold strokes of his signature. Caleb Whitaker. His words were careful, almost guarded, but she could feel the steadiness behind them. She wrote again, answering his questions about the city, telling him about her students, and the way she could hear the L trains passing her window at night. She asked about the work on the ranch, about what Jaime liked to read, about the weather in Wyoming. She didn't push, but she didn't disappear either. And so the letters began to flow, slow but steady, over the course of weeks. Jaime's notes were bright with excitement, drawings of the barn, clumsy sketches of Scout, tales of chasing rabbits through the snow. Caleb's letters were shorter, more factual, but sometimes Elena caught a glimmer of humor tucked between his lines, like sunlight breaking through clouds. She began to imagine the ranch, the boy with ink-smudged fingers, the man with careful words. The city seemed louder now, harsher, and more crowded than before. One night, as wind rattled her window panes, she sat with her last letter from Caleb in her lap. It described the changing seasons, how the first snow had come early, blanketing the hills in white. He had written that the nights were long, but the stars were sharp and bright, like you could almost reach out and pluck them from the sky. Without quite realizing she had made the decision, Elena reached for a fresh sheet of paper. "Caleb," she wrote, "I've been thinking. I'd like to see the ranch for myself. I know it's far, and perhaps it's foolish, but there's a train that goes as far as Cheyenne, and I could find my way from there. I don't want to intrude, but I would very much like to meet you and Jaime in person." She hesitated only a moment before sealing the envelope. By the time she placed it in the mailbox the next morning, her pulse was quick and her cheeks flushed from more than the cold. Back in Wyoming, Caleb unfolded her letter slowly, reading it twice. Jaime leaned over the table, eyes bright. "She's coming." Caleb met his son's gaze. uncertain whether to be firm or hopeful. But something in the memory of Elena's steady, graceful handwriting told him that perhaps, just this once, he could allow a little hope. "She says she wants to," he said. "We'll see if she means it." But when he set the letter down, his hand lingered on the page, and in the quiet kitchen, a thought he hadn't allowed in years flickered to life. The train groaned and hissed as it pulled into Cheyenne's small station, the steel wheels grinding to a reluctant halt. Elena stepped down from the carriage, one gloved hand gripping the railing, the other clutching the handle of her single, battered suitcase. The wind caught at her scarf, carrying the scent of snow and wood smoke. She paused for a moment, blinking against the pale glare of winter light, taking in the sight of open sky stretching in every direction. Chicago had been all narrow streets and towering buildings. Here, the land lay bare and unbroken, a vast, silent sweep of hills and plains. It made her feel smaller, lighter, as if the weight she had been carrying for months had loosened in the cold air. A tall man in a worn hat stood near the end of the platform, the brim pulled low over eyes the color of weathered wood. Beside him was a boy she recognized instantly from the drawings in his letters. Jaimes' grin was wide, his cheeks red from the wind, his gloved hand waving frantically. "Miss Elena," he called, bouncing on his toes. Her heart leapt. She hurried toward them, her boots clacking against the wooden planks. Jaime ran to meet her, nearly tripping over his own feet before flinging his arms around her waist. "You came. I told you it would be cold, but you came anyway." His words tumbled over each other in his excitement. She laughed, smoothing his hair beneath his cap. "I wouldn't have missed it for anything." Caleb stepped forward, his posture straight but not stiff. "Miss Morales," he said, tipping his hat slightly. "Welcome to Wyoming." "Thank you," she replied, meeting his gaze. His handshake was firm, his palm calloused, the kind of grip that spoke of years of honest work. They walked to the wagon waiting outside the station, its wooden bed dusted with a thin layer of snow. Caleb lifted her suitcase easily into the back, then offered a hand to help her up onto the bench. Jaime scrambled up beside her, still chattering about everything they'd passed on the way into town. As the wagon rolled out of Cheyenne, the world seemed to open wider with every mile. The wind pressed against her cheeks, sharp and invigorating. They passed stretches of frozen pasture, the occasional cluster of bare cottonwoods and cattle grazing with their heads bent low against the cold. Jaime pointed out landmarks with uncontained enthusiasm. "That's where we saw a coyote last spring. Over there's the creek that floods every summer." Caleb's deep voice occasionally added a quiet fact or two, though his attention stayed mostly on the road. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had dipped toward the horizon, painting the snow in strokes of rose and gold. The house stood sturdy and square against the wind, its wooden siding weathered but well kept. Beyond it, the barn's roof was dusted white, and the corral held a small cluster of horses, their breaths steaming in the cold. Inside, the kitchen was warm from the wood stove. The air smelled faintly of coffee, and the bread Caleb had baked that morning. Elena shed her coat, feeling the heat seep into her bones. "You can take the room at the end of the hall," Caleb said, setting her suitcase just inside the door. The room was simple, a bed neatly made, a small dresser, a single lamp casting a soft glow. But it was tidy, and the quilt on the bed was hand-stitched, each patch sewn with care. At supper, Jaime talked enough for all three of them. He asked her about the train ride, about whether Chicago really had streets so crowded you could hardly walk. Elena answered between bites, her voice warm and animated. She asked about ranch life, and Jaime happily explained how they fed the cattle and what chores needed doing in winter. Caleb mostly listened, though Elena noticed the way his gaze lingered on her hands when she spoke, the faint crease in his brow as if weighing something unspoken. After the table was cleared, Jaime disappeared to his room with a book, leaving the two of them alone in the kitchen. Caleb poured himself another cup of coffee, then nodded toward the wood box by the stove. "You ever chop kindling?" he asked. "Only once," she admitted. "And I wasn't very good at it," he almost smiled. "Then we'll leave that to me." The next morning, she woke to the sound of boots on the porch and the creak of the barn door in the distance. Pulling on her coat, she stepped outside, the cold biting at her nose. Caleb was already in the corral, brushing down a chestnut mare. "Thought I'd give you the gentlest one," he said when he saw her, "if you want to try riding." She hesitated, then took the reins he offered. The horse's breath billowed in the frosty air, and the leather was cool under her fingers. Caleb walked beside her as she mounted, steadying her without a word. The ride was slow, deliberate, the snow crunching under the mare's hooves. Caleb pointed out the boundaries of the ranch, the best grazing pastures, the windbreak where they planted cottonwoods years ago. His voice was calmer out here, as if the wide space between sky and ground made it easier to speak. By the time they returned, Elena's cheeks were flushed, her eyes bright from the cold. Jamie was waiting at the fence, eager to hear how it went. She told him the truth, that she had been nervous, but it was worth it just to see the land from a horse's back. Over the next few days, a rhythm began to form. She helped Jamie with his lessons by the fire in the evenings, baked bread in the kitchen, and learned how to mend a fence with Caleb watching quietly to make sure she didn't hammer her thumb. It wasn't without its awkward moments. Once she left the barn door unlatched and spent half an hour chasing a runaway chicken. Another time she spilled coffee grounds all over the stove. But each time Jamie laughed so hard he could barely stand, and Caleb's quiet, "It happens," was strangely reassuring. One evening, after Jamie had gone to bed, Elena found herself lingering in the kitchen, while Caleb finished writing in a small ledger. The lamplight pooled across the table, turning the rough grain of the wood into warm gold. "You run this place all by yourself," she said softly. "With Jamie," he corrected. "He's more help than most grown men I've hired." She smiled. "He's a good boy." Caleb looked up at her, and for a moment his gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "He is," he said, and there was something in his voice, pride, certainly, but also a quiet hope that made her chest tighten. She went to bed that night, listening to the wind outside, thinking that perhaps she had stepped into something she didn't fully understand yet. But whatever it was, it felt worth staying for. The wind had been restless all afternoon, rattling loose shutters and sighing through the cracks in the barn walls. By sundown, the clouds had rolled low over the hills, dark and swollen, promising more than just snow. Caleb stood on the porch with his arms crossed, scanning the horizon. The air carried the sharp tang of ozone, the warning scent of a storm. Inside, Jamie and Elena were seated at the table, a lantern between them, the pages of a book spread open. Jamie's voice carried the sing-song rhythm of reading aloud, but his eyes kept flicking toward the window whenever the wind howled. Caleb stepped back inside, stamping the snow from his boots. "We might get lightning tonight," he said. "Storm like this, the cattle could spook." Elena looked up. "Is that dangerous?" "It can be," he replied, his voice even. "If they break through the fences, they can scatter for miles. Takes days to bring them back." Jamie bit his lip. "Will you have to go out there?" Caleb's answer was the quiet, steady sort that brooked no argument. "If they spook, yes." The first crack of thunder came just after supper, low and distant. By the time Caleb was pulling on his coat, it was closer, rolling through the valley like a drum. Scout, who had been dozing by the stove, rose to his feet with a soft whine. "I'll be back when I can," Caleb told Jamie. "Stay inside." "Help your mama," he caught himself, glancing at Elena. "Help Miss Elena keep the fire going." Elena pulled her shawl tighter. "Be careful." Caleb gave a single nod before stepping out into the night. For a while, the only sound was the wind against the walls and the occasional pop from the fire. Then, faint but sharp, came the frantic bawl of cattle somewhere out in the dark. Elena could picture them, eyes rolling white, hooves pounding against the frozen ground, and Caleb riding hard to keep them from breaking through the far fence. She tried to focus on Jamie's reading, but each flash of lightning lit the room starkly, followed by thunder that rattled the glass. The boy was trying to be brave, she could see that, but his voice wavered. When the knock came at the door, it startled them both. It was Hank from the neighboring ranch, his hat dripping with melted snow. his breath coming fast. "Fence is down by the south ridge," he said. "Your man's horse took a bad step in a washout. He's stranded." Elena's heart clenched. "Where?" Hank shook his head. "Hard to say in this weather. Somewhere near Dry Creek. I told him I'd send someone, but the wind's picking up and—" "I'll go," Elena said, already reaching for her coat. Jaime's eyes went wide. "You can't." "I can," she said firmly. She turned to Hank. "I'll take your horse." Hank hesitated, glancing toward Jaime, but something in her face must have convinced him. He nodded and hurried back into the storm. The horse was big and restless under her hands, the whites of its eyes flashing in the lantern light. Elena swallowed her fear, remembering the mare Caleb had given her to ride days earlier, the patient rhythm of hooves on snow. She mounted, the saddle cold against her legs, and urged the animal forward. The wind bit at her face, and snow stung her cheeks like tiny needles. She kept her head low, eyes scanning the ground for the washout Hank had mentioned. The world narrowed to the circle of light from the lantern tied to the saddle horn. At last she saw him. Caleb, crouched beside his horse, one arm looped around its neck to keep it steady. Relief surged through her, so strong it made her throat ache. "Caleb!" she called over the wind. He looked up, surprise flashing in his eyes. "Elena, what in?" "No time," she shouted back. "Can you ride?" He glanced at the injured horse, then at hers. "Not both of us." "I'll lead him back slow," she said. "You ride with me." For a moment, he just stared at her, the wind whipping his coat around his legs. Then, with a muttered curse she couldn't hear, he swung up behind her. His arms came around her to take the reins, the heat of him seeping through her coat. The ride back was slower, the wind driving hard against them. She could feel the tension in his body, the way he kept scanning the shadows, listening for movement. When the house finally came into view, lantern light spilling warm onto the snow, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Inside, Jaime ran to them, relief plain on his face. "You're okay," he cried, throwing his arms around Caleb's waist. "We're okay," Caleb said, his hand on the boy's shoulder. Then he looked at Elena, and for the first time since she'd arrived, there was nothing guarded in his eyes. Later, after Jaime was in bed and the storm had quieted, they sat at the kitchen table with mugs of coffee, the fire crackling low. Caleb's voice was rough when he spoke. "You shouldn't have come out there." "I couldn't stay here knowing you were hurt," she replied. He shook his head, but his gaze softened. "You've got more grit than I gave you credit for." She smiled faintly. "You've got more heart than you let on." Silence settled between them, warm and not uncomfortable. Then, slowly, Caleb reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. It was a small touch, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid. "Elena," he said quietly, "I don't know what you came here looking for, but I know what I've found." Her breath caught. "And what's that?" He held her gaze. "A reason to stop being alone." The words settled deep in her chest, steady and certain. She turned her hand under his, lacing their fingers together. When he leaned across the table to kiss her, it was slow and deliberate, a promise rather than a question. And in that moment, with the storm's echo fading outside, she knew she had found her place. Snow came early that year, a soft, heavy blanket that muffled the sounds of the ranch and left the world wrapped in white. The air was cold enough that each breath rose like a small cloud, but inside the Whitaker house, the fire burned steady, filling the rooms with heat and the faint scent of pine from the logs Caleb had split the day before. Elena stood at the window in the front room, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, watching the flakes drift lazily down. Jaime was outside with Scout, their tracks looping across the yard as they played some game only they seemed to understand. She smiled, the kind of smile that came easily these days. Behind her, Caleb came in from the barn, stamping snow from his boots. He paused just inside the door, looking at her with that quiet gaze she had come to know so well. steady, measuring, and warm in a way that didn't need words. "Cold?" he asked, unbuttoning his coat. "Not in here," she replied. She tilted her head toward the window. "Jaimes been out there for nearly an hour. I'm not sure who's having more fun, him or the dog." Caleb chuckled softly, setting his gloves on the table. For a moment he stood there, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small box. "I've been meaning to ask you this," he said, stepping closer. His voice was low but sure, and his eyes didn't leave hers. "You came here without knowing what you'd find. You stayed when you didn't have to. You've made this place feel like a home again. Elena, will you marry me?" Her breath caught. She opened the box, and inside was a simple gold band, worn smooth but polished to a soft shine. It was not extravagant, but it was real, and it was offered with a sincerity that made her throat tighten. "Yes," she said, the word breaking into a smile. "Of course, yes." Caleb's shoulders eased, the faintest grin touching his mouth. He slid the ring onto her finger, and for a moment they simply stood there, the snow falling outside, the fire crackling in the hearth. When they told Jaime, he shouted so loudly Scout started barking. "I knew it," he said, throwing his arms around both of them at once. "I told you it would work." The wedding was small, held in the front room of the ranch house 2 weeks later. The snow was still deep, and the road into town nearly impassable, so only a few neighbors and friends came. Mr. Harris from the general store, Hank from the next ranch over, and the schoolteacher from town who had become Elena's friend. Jaime insisted on walking her down the short aisle they'd made between the chairs. He stood tall, his hand gripping hers, pride shining in his eyes. Caleb waited by the fireplace, his suit jacket pressed and his hair neatly combed, but his smile was the same quiet, certain one she'd first seen when they sat at the kitchen table weeks ago. The ceremony was brief, but full of meaning. When the vows were spoken, Caleb's voice was steady, Elena's warm and sure. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only the clear truth that they had each found what they needed in the other. Afterward, they shared cake and coffee, the room filled with the hum of easy conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. Jaime sat between them, beaming, telling anyone who would listen that he'd been the one to write the letter that started it all. In the weeks that followed, life at the ranch settled into a new rhythm. Elena continued teaching at the small schoolhouse in town, riding in each morning bundled against the cold. She returned in the afternoons to help with chores, her hands growing more sure with each task, mending harness leather, checking on the calves, keeping the kitchen stocked and warm. Caleb no longer worked in silence as much as he used to. He would tell her about the day's repairs, about which cattle needed moving to better pasture, about the things he noticed in the weather that might mean snow or thaw. And at night, they would sit by the fire with Jaime between them, reading or talking until the boy's eyelids grew heavy. Spring came slowly, the snow melting into rivulets that ran down the hillsides, the grass pushing through in hesitant patches of green. One morning, Elena stepped out onto the porch to find the air smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. Caleb joined her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Looks like we'll have an early calving season," he said. She smiled, leaning against the railing. "Then we'd better be ready." They watched as Jaime ran out into the yard, Scout close at his heels, both of them chasing the morning with a kind of energy that made Elena's heart swell. That summer, Caleb built a new fence along the north pasture, with Jaime carrying nails in a bucket and Elena handing him tools. In the evenings, they ate on the porch, the sun dipping low over the horizon, the sky painted in shades of gold and rose. Autumn brought the first real harvest from the small garden Elena had started behind the house. She stood at the kitchen counter with baskets of potatoes, carrots, and beans, smiling at how something so small could make her feel so accomplished. Caleb came in from the fields, brushed a kiss against her temple, and said simply, "You've made this place better." Winter came again, but it was different now. The house felt fuller, warmer. The long nights were lit not just by the fire, but by the easy closeness they had built. On Christmas Eve, Jaime gave them a small scrapbook he had been working on for months. Inside were drawings, pressed flowers, and notes marking their family firsts. their first supper all together, their first ride out to the far pasture, the day Elena taught him to bake bread. On the last page, in careful letters he had written, "The day I got my mom." Elena felt tears prick her eyes. She looked at Caleb, and he reached for her hand, their fingers twining together. That night, after Jamie had gone to bed, they stepped out onto the porch. Snow was falling softly, the flakes catching in her hair. Caleb slipped his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in silence, watching the world turn white again. Jamie's voice carried faintly from inside, calling to Scout, and Elena leaned into Caleb's side. She thought of the day she'd opened that letter in her small Chicago room, the boy's words simple and direct. "You need a home, and I need a mommy." She had found her home, and in the quiet, snowy night, she knew she would never leave it. In the wide, untamed beauty of the Wyoming plains, one letter bridged the distance between loneliness and love, turning strangers into a family. Caleb, Elena, and Jamie proved that sometimes the simplest words can change the course of a lifetime, and that home is not just a place, but the hearts you share it with. If you enjoyed this heartwarming journey, saddle up for more tales of passion, courage, and romance under the open skies. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Chronicles and never miss another story that will make your heart gallop.